What's a dark part of American history that doesn't get enough attention? Best of Reddit. Daily new uploads. Subscribe and like for more. Just do it. The murder of Mary Turner, Mary's husband, Hayes, was lynched by a mob of white people in 1918 in southern Georgia. After Mary, 8 months pregnant at the time, publicly denounced her husband's murder, the mob turned to her and wanted to teach her a lesson. She escaped but was captured the next day and hung upside down from her ankles. They cut her stomach open and the child fell out, started crying, and one of the members of the mob stepped on its head. Then they shot her a few hundred times. The mob killed 13 people. None of the members of the mob were ever charged. May 1918 lynchings. https://en.m.wikipedia.org Wiki May 1918 lynchings. Jesus fuck. Da fuck is wrong with people? If you are enjoying the video, subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of my new videos. They're racist. This was only 10 years before my grandmother was born. Literally the generation that raised my grandparents. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was pretty fucked up. African American men were told they would get free treatment, but instead were left untreated. Do scientists could study the progression of untreated syphilis. J. Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, perfected his surgical techniques by operating without anesthesia on enslaved black women. https://en.m.wikipedia.org Wiki J. Marion Sims. Men called him a braggart. Not only was he an evil doctor, but he also bragged about his evil practice. WTF. The US Gov did that with a lot of POC, including Guatemala back in the 40s. Puerto Rico too, with the water, and specifically focused on the fertility of the women. They did this in Central America too. Add to this Henrietta Lacks. Edit. Yes, objectively you could argue Tuskegee was 1,500 times more brutal, but the point I was getting at was the systemic problem of medicine at the time, treating black folk as subhuman to the point that abuse of patients and medical ethics was just seen as part of a normal day. That's not in any way equivocal. Henrietta Lacks did not physically suffer or get more disabled because of the tissue they kept. The Native American boarding schools. Here in Phoenix, one of our major roads is named Indian School after the school that was once there. It's a lot more recent than you think. I used to work with a guy whose father was a teacher there. The Herd Museum in downtown has an exhibit which covers the school. It is jaw-dropping. We took native children and for all intents and purposes tried to metaphorically beat their culture out of them. My great-grandmother was in a residential school. She wasn't there a full year because her father heard what was happening and basically broke in to kidnap her. She spent the rest of her life hiding. She powdered every inch of visible skin and dyed her hair brown. She hid her children because she was afraid the government would come for them too. Residential schools fucked up a lot of people. I'm still on the fence about the Herd Museum. My mom used to work there and had a shit time with the employees who always talked down to her despite being native herself. But to each their own. I get that. When I went through there the first time, I was at once impressed by their collection of artifacts while at the same time wondering, how did you get all this stuff? Exactly. In Canada, we call those residential schools. They teach us a lot about them every year. To our schools, it's very important we know what they are and what happened in them. Edit. Grammar. Canada too. Which is fucked considering most people equate us with not being as racist, but we did a lot of fucked up shit too. Marty Glickman, who was faster than Jesse Owens, not being allowed by the American team Avery Bundage to run in the 1936 Olympics, so as not to offend Hitler that a Jew was the fastest man in the world. I feel like that was kind of for his own safety though. Like, who's to say that Hitler wouldn't have kidnapped, arrested him from his hotel room and have him killed? Hitler fiercely wanted the US to stay in Germany's good graces. I doubt killing one of their athletes would have achieved this. Those human zoos where people could go look at people of color in big cities like New York. Excuse me, what? You know how we strip animals of their natural habitat, in many cases families, and force them to suffer neglect and loneliness? We used to do that to people too. Iman, need a source on that. Not that I don't believe you. Other guy did you dirty with a vague zoo link. Here's a direct link. https://en.m.wikipedia.org Wiki Human Zoo. back to Wikipedia's page on human zoos. Enjoying the video? Leave a comment below. 3. Check out the St. Louis World Fair of 1904. Not only just people of color, the P.T. Barnum Freak Show featured people with disabilities and deformations. Not a US but the life of Sarah Bachman goes into detail on what it was like to be part of a human zoo, and how she and others were even exploited after death as well. https://wikipedia.org wiki Sarah Bachman. https://youtube/TRZMN6LQECU. Gosh, I feel so sad seeing her name, the things they did to her after her death, displaying her remains, just cruel and disgusting. Eugenics prior to World War II. Hitler obviously took it to a whole other level with his Aryan race, but it was widely believed across the world that sterilizing or euthanizing people with mental illnesses or birth defects would lead to a better, healthier society. Technically, removing bad genes from the pool does make the species stronger. Society, not so much. The idea is still discussed, with some merit. Getting rid of stuff that clearly has a genetic component does strengthen the gene pool, that's clear, and whether or not purging highly undesirable traits is a very interesting topic. Is gene pool strength relevant, however? Looking, of course, at individuals like Stephen Hawking and whatnot as the obvious example. Do undesirable traits automatically make undesirable people? Seems an obvious not necessarily to me, and, further, a strong gene pool might be useful in a hunter-gatherer society of pre-language people, but we're generally a smidge past that. Seriously, the US was a major player in the early campaigns for eugenics. If it hadn't been for Germany beating us there, we would have kept going further down that road. Even Margaret Sanger, the woman who founded Planned Parenthood and underwrote the research for the birth control pill, supported eugenics. https://en.m.wikipedia.org wiki Margaret Sanger prov equals ft1. I really don't feel like public schools emphasize how popular of a movement eugenics was both in the US and globally. The presidential assassination that no one talks about, James A. Garfield, he was I believe the 20th president. It's a really interesting story, and the YouTube channel Sam Onello Academy has a really good video on it. The destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Letting German and Japanese war crimes be forgotten in exchange for experiment results in World War II. We think it is wrong you torture those people, but could we maybe see the results? Last in Unit 731. Japan was just straight up pardoned so the US could have Asia Pacific bases and ports readily available. Japan is basically an extension of the US military, and that's exactly what we wanted. Just about every Asian country with a coast is still peeved at Japan, and twice more at the US for letting it all go, not just unpunished, but giving Japan an economic golden age right after. A lot of people think the Klan was mostly a southern thing. It wasn't. In the 1920s, Michigan and other Midwest states had quite a lot of Klan activity. It didn't end there. When I was growing up in 70s Michigan, racism and segregation were still baked into the cake, with redlining and, in the case of my hometown, running any black family who tried to move out of town. My parents' neighbor in Maryland burned crosses in his yard and hosted Klan meetings in the mid to late 1980s. Not so cool fact, when you see a business that uses consecutive KS in its name, you've very likely found a former Klan business. For example, Corey's Car Care. 1-877 Cars for Kids? Not even the Klan is that despicable. Cars for Kids is a xenophobic ultra-religious group that raises money to send Jewish boys to summer camp. They are unethical and under investigation in several states. I 100% know that wasn't your point, but I hate them and the ad so much I take every chance to mention those facts. The KKK started in Indiana. Most people aren't aware of that. In the 1920s, 1/3 of Indiana's white population were members. Still being done today, down in my hometown in the South, that still has Klan on the police force and meeting off the highway in the back of a dive bar. There's a defunct railroad that splits the town in two, Brooklyn and the rest of the town, and I cannot recall a single black person living on the white side of town. No black kids ever rode on my school bus, because its route was down the white side of town. Last time I visited my dad down there, in 2009, a church had opened up a private school from donations because there's too many gang members in the school, which is code for we want to segregate our white kids from the black kids. the numerous war crimes that the United States military has committed but get buried and hidden away by American history for the sake of patriotism. An example, General Jacob H. Smith and his slaughter of tens of thousands of Filipino civilians during the Philippine-American War. His famous orders were to kill anyone over 10. His court-martial was written off to preserve the honorable image of the American military, and he retired and lived out the rest of his life in Ohio, and was later buried in Arlington Cemetery. I'm not an expert, but I think that a few years ago the US made it illegal for The Hague to send war crime investigators to the US and would declare war on The Hague if they did. Not sure though. Don't forget to leave your comment. It's no that we made it illegal per se, we pulled out of the Rome Treaty. There's a law passed by the US legislature that says if The Hague ever attempts to investigate a US soldier for war crimes, it is grounds for invasion of the Netherlands. It was passed in 2002 and is the perfect example of how rotten the US is while preaching about democracy. What really blew my mind was when we learned in school about the racism towards the Irish during the early 1900s. To me the most interesting part is that they were hired, with very low wages, to do jobs that people wouldn't send their slaves to do as it was too dangerous. Every Irish person has seen the sign "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish," or some various less pleasant combinations of that. This is a huge one I think more people should be aware of. White supremacists try to make it seem like there's a good reason for white people to be in charge. Some people hear that and start to think, well, it was always non-white people who were treated as lesser in history, so maybe there is a good reason for white people to have all the power. But then you learn about how Irish people were treated. Fun fact, ever hear the phrase "luck of the Irish"? That wasn't a positive saying originally. What it meant was these stupid Irish people are only succeeding because of pure luck. They obviously can't have the skill to accomplish anything legitimately. Race is an imaginary concept, and people have used it to discriminate against any group they please. Racism is about putting someone below you, and that someone can be absolutely anyone. If the white supremacists did get their all-white homeland like they keep asking, by tomorrow they would have declared that some white people are better than others. And if you deported every one of that new group they'd found, by the next day they would have come up with another group to hate. Also another sickening story is that of the lynching of Jesse Washington, where a large part of the city of Waco, TX, publicly burned Jesse alive over the course of hours, and sold body parts as souvenirs. Tulsa race riot of 1921 always stuck with me. Calling it a race riot isn't a good description of what it actually was. More like a racist massacre. Most Tulsans I know do refer to it as a massacre. I am from Tulsa. Never understood why it was called a riot in the first place. Seems like a cheap way to make it seem less racist, I guess. We have archaeologists searching for the mass graves currently. A lot of local racists are pissed about it. From what I've gathered it was called a riot so insurance didn't have to fork out money to those that lost their homes and businesses. I grew up near there. I learned about it in first grade as the Oklahoma firebombing. That still seems more accurate to me. But if I use that name out of the area, everyone assumes I mean the Oklahoma City bombing. Yet airplanes dropping explosives on civilians is just a tad bit more than a riot in my book. Probably the best answer in this thread. Most people know about Japanese internment camps and the Trail of Tears. The Tulsa race riot isn't well known though. I think there are so many ghosts in American history. I love America, but these stories need to told. So many stories of contributions from all people, including people of color, are untold. Slavery is not the only history of blacks in America. As a lover of history I appreciate this post. I literally had no idea about this until Watchmen. That scene in Watchmen seems like an exaggeration, but that's how it went down. The scene of the whole city on fire and everything. The pictures from that day look exactly the same. That's exactly what I thought. I thought it was blowing racism out of proportion. A plane bombing black people? You're okay, sure. Then my jaw hit the floor when I read it was real and the scenes was actually a pretty good depiction of the event. A lot of the difference in perspective between white and black Americans is that the former have simply never heard of historical atrocities like this, while the latter do not have the luxury of forgetting. Imagine how differently you'd view your culture if you'd grown up hearing about massacres like this, and it was your people on the receiving end. Colonialism in a nutshell, namely the Philippines and Hawaii, come to mind for me first. Also the pardoning of Japanese war criminals and paying for Unit 731's data is a big dark stain. Let's not forget Puerto Rico either. The US convinced Puerto Rican freedom fighters to overthrow the Spanish, and after the battle for independence was almost over they swooped in and seized control. The Puerto Rican revolutionaries thought they would be given the right to rule, but instead the US used the island as a base of operation to hide tax money and do human medical experiments while the people there suffered in poverty. Or how the US basically organized a coup against Hawaii, then used it as an excuse to annex the islands. The year without a summer 1816. The eruption of Mount Tambora blocked out a lot of sunlight, led to one of the darkest years in history. I was going to say treatment of Native Americans, but that's been stated already. So let's instead name the massacres of early trade unionists. The Ludlow massacre comes to mind as one example from April 1914, but it was far from the only one. The railroad strikes of 1877 are often overlooked. About 100,000 workers were striking across the country and over 100 were gunned down by police and National Guardsmen. Violence against African Americans in the post-Reconstruction South is very well studied. However, the lengths by which honest-to-goodness white supremacists went to with their sexual violence against African Americans is truly something horrifying. I understand why it isn't touched on too much before high school, and I also understand why it isn't discussed deeply in depth in high school either, but it's pretty ignored compared to the degree that it occurred. If you are enjoying the video, subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of my new videos. Indian Removal Act. Americans pushed the Native Americans Indians out of their homeland, killing anyone who refused to leave. Americans claimed it was their God-given right to take whatever land they wanted. Natives would trade, and have treaties before this. It's sad. The 1973 Chilean coup d'etat, https://en.m.wikipedia.org Wiki 1973 Chilean coup d'etat was our country's original 9/11 because it happened on the 11th of September, 1973. It was an absolutely despicable action that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The US government essentially funded the uprising of the most violent dictator Chile has ever seen, named Augusto Pinochet. This happened following an extended period of social unrest and political tension between the opposition-controlled Congress of Chile and the socialist President Salvador Allende, as well as the economic warfare ordered by US President Richard Nixon. This was a terrible world event that got overshadowed by another terrible world event. I'm not saying the Twin Tower attacks weren't horrible. They were absolutely awful and dreadful. However, it's important to remember both events and be aware of it. The US government essentially funded the uprising of the most violent dictator Chile has ever seen, named Augusto Pinochet. US has a lot of examples like this from recent history. They even propped up Saddam Hussein in Iraq for a while when they thought they could use him against Iran. It's kind of insane that the USA tries to act like a beacon of democracy while allied with terrorists, pushing covert coups, backing fascist dictators, and enacting regime change through wars based on lies. Pretty much everything related to Native Americans. What we did to them is totally downplayed and often justified as us being the stronger force who won the war. Lots of broken treaties and not a lot of natives treated as human beings. We were reasonably consistent in our shittiness. History is written by the victors. He who controls the present, controls the past. No one likes to talk about how much we suppress their culture and beliefs. Religious dances and ceremonies were outlawed until the 70s. For sure, we converted their religion, language, cultural rituals, etc. We gave them smallpox, removed their children from their homes, stole their land, pushed them onto reservations so we could control them easier, intentionally killed and tortured them, etc. Yeah, we like to act like we simply won a war, but we did so much more than that. It's quite a shame. The Elaine massacre in Arkansas, where about 200 black people were massacred. They don't have an official burial site, but there's a mound in a cotton field where those hundreds of bodies are said to be buried. A couple months ago I also just learned about the Chicago race riots, where black citizens in Chicago were attacked and the city was in chaos for 10 days. Side note, I don't like calling it a riot because I feel like that implies that both sides were guilty and participating, but black people were being attacked for merely existing and they only really fought back but never started the fights. Both of these happened in 1919. There were multiple attacks on black people that year, but that's never discussed. And in a book of reports from the Chicago race riots, they work hard to put blame on both sides. Mother's Day, 1985, Philadelphia 6221 Osage Avenue, Move Massacre. German internment camps. Largest one was in North Dakota. That the Nazis got the inspiration of the gas chambers from the US. The US put Mexicans coming into the US into a chamber where they were put in a chamber where gas was released. It was meant to cleanse them, but the Nazis decided to use a lethal dose of the gas. The US continued to use non-lethal gas chambers on Mexicans even after World War II. Japanese internment camps. Japanese American internment camps. Japanese Americans were not the only ones interned, though they made up the vast majority of internees. There were also native Inuits, German Americans and Italian Americans, but most of them just had their property stolen. All the awful stuff Columbus did. He punished people for minor crimes such as stealing food by cutting off body parts and selling them into slavery. He congratulated his brother for marching a woman naked through the streets and having her tongue cut out after she insulted their family. He dealt with a rebellion by dismembering the rebels and marching their mutilated corpses through the streets as a warning to the others. He was awful enough that the Spanish government, who weren't exactly known for being a kindly and humanitarian organization, had him removed as governor and imprisoned as punishment for his atrocities. Needless to say, he was let out after 6 weeks, because he was rich and famous. Pre-Columbian violence amongst the Native Americans. Among the Iroquoian nations in the Northeast, mourning wars were practiced. Such conflicts involved raiding with the intent to capture prisoners, who were then adopted by bereaved families to replace family members who had died prematurely due to illness or war. MKUltra, the CIA and USA Biological Warfare Laboratory's mind control program. MKUltra used numerous methods to manipulate people's mental states and alter brain functions, including the surreptitious administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs, especially LSD and other chemicals, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, as well as other forms of torture. Oh please, you hear about this one all the damn time. The dark part of American history in the last few decades has been the educational system. The fact that the Alamo, Texas Spanish-American War was about Mexico making slavery illegal, and Texas declaring independence as a result. The US were the bad guys in that war. That is not true. First off, the Spanish-American War is a completely different war and almost in a different century than the Texas Revolution. Secondly, the United States had little to no involvement in the Texas Revolution. It was the Republic of Texas. And finally, the Texas Revolution was entirely built off of an increase in animosity with Tejano and colonist relations. The last straw was the Gonzales Cannon incident, which is what kicked off the war. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like and hit the bell for more videos. Comment your views.